are some things in life unacceptable? When I'm talking about awakening and realization, and specifically when I'm talking about equanimity and investigating the nature of our own reactivity, tendency to contract, and specifically our avoidance of accepting things as they are and wanting to try to turn them into our pre-programmed, stereotyped mental constructs about how they should be, then inevitably, at some point, practitioners will come to a place where they really see what I'm talking about. And they'll feel like, well, some things in life just aren't acceptable. Now, while that's a normal, typical response, it demonstrates the conditioned mind's misunderstanding of what equanimity actually is and what it means. Now, understand in this video, I'm not making a philosophical claim and I'm not talking about morality. I'm talking about your own internal process and your potential to experience equanimity ongoing by dissolving the reactive body or by dissolving the filters that make it appear as if we have to react, as if some things that occur are so unacceptable that we have to have an internal reaction or an external reaction to them, a reaction based on the illusion of separate self. So it's very common for the mind or the ego to get really fired up about this stuff. And what it typically does, even if I'm talking about a simple and pragmatic way of applying this or investigating this in your day-to-day life, the mind tends to come up with the most extreme examples possible. Well, what about Nazi Germany? What about genocide? These types of questions. And I'm not exaggerating, this is usually what happens. What I would say is when the mind starts doing that, it's usually a defense mechanism. It's not wanting to see what's being said. Often if that does come up with a practitioner I'm working directly with in the moment, I'll say, well, is that happening for you right now? Well, no. It's like, okay, well, of the 30 million thoughts or examples you could have come up with right now, isn't it interesting that the mind picked up the most extreme possible example to counteract what I'm saying? Now that often helps people redirect to the momentary experience and really feel into what I'm actually talking about. But more precisely, when we're talking about equanimity work, when we're talking about suffering, it boils down to something very simple. The reason we suffer, or the vast majority of human suffering, and the way I talk about suffering, comes from a very simple misunderstanding. And it looks like this. Here's what's happening, and I don't want it to be that way, period. And I believe that by not wanting it to be that way, I can change it. This is a misunderstanding. And here's a very simple reminder of how this mechanism works. By the time you notice something happening, anything, whatever's happening right now, by the time you notice what's right in front of your face, by the time you witness an event, by the time you become aware of the situation or the circumstances, it's already in the past. It's already happened. So it's always a cognitive distortion when we actually believe it shouldn't be that way. It just is that way. This is the way it is. The mind is making innocent pictures of it, but the sense of will and the misunderstanding that there's a separate self acting against an environment misinterprets that. It turns it into something like, oh, well, I'm going to turn what is into what should be. And by the time you believe that one thought, literally, by the time that's believed, the ego structure is very much in charge. The ego already has you convinced that it is you, that its thoughts are your thoughts, and so forth. So sometimes you just have to go back through this in your mind a few times to realize, okay, by the time I'm aware of what's happening, by the time the mind takes a picture through the senses of the circumstances, conditions, and experience right now, it's already done. It's happened. Nothing's going to change that. Nothing's going to make that not have happened. Doesn't matter if it's the worst thing in the world or the best thing in the world. It still happened. And this misunderstanding and overlooking the truth of this is what causes us to suffer. It's the first step in suffering, ultimately. There are underlying perceptual filters that makes this even possible, but actual suffering typically starts here. So a good exercise is, if you do feel that what's happening in life is unacceptable, or that certain things that happen in life are unacceptable, it can be really helpful to unpack that, to ask yourself, okay, in an actual situation, if something happens, perhaps something I wouldn't have wanted to happen, something, let's say, undesirable happened, something uncomfortable, something painful, where does it become unacceptable? And what is the price to be paid when I decide something is unacceptable? This can be really helpful to look into, and it can be challenging. It can be really uncomfortable because we want to believe we can control life in a way that we really can't. So for instance, who pays that price? You obviously didn't change the external circumstances by not wanting them. But what was the effect? What's the cost and who pays it? Where does your attention go once you've decided that what's actually happening in the world around you is unacceptable? Where's the only place the attention can actually go if you believe that? Right into the mind, into magic land, into the house of mirrors of thought. But what would happen if you actually did accept it? Is it possible to accept everything that happens on a moment-to-moment basis? And what would that be like? What would that feel like? Well, I will tell you it is possible, and it feels like equanimity. It feels like you're getting away with something. It's surprisingly effortless. It's surprisingly enjoyable. And it's surprisingly natural, because whatever happened, by the time you're aware of it, it's just what happened. To construct a false self that takes a position against that and tries to convince itself that didn't happen, or that it can change how it happened, is absurd. You can't go back in time. It's impossible. So it would seem that by living this way, you'll be taken advantage of, or you'll have no morality. But it's just not true. What you find is that you can actually respond in a meaningful and intelligent way easily, because you're not looking through the BS of your own interpretations. You're just seeing what is. When you see what is, it's much easier to respond to what's happening instead of reacting to what you think is happening or what should be happening, which again turns into a house of mirrors very quickly. It's a deeply peaceful and equanimous way to live, seeing that what is the only way it could be, and that there's actually nothing that could make it other than this. And because there's nothing that could make it other than this, there's no need to entertain the belief that it could be other than this. And that frees up so much energy. It relinquishes struggle. It calms the inner world. It makes clear seeing so much easier. And it leads into deeper realization pretty quickly. The reactive self makes so much noise. It takes so much of our energy. And it feels so much like who we are that we really don't realize the cost of it. But we can investigate it directly. Find any example where what's actually happening is overlooked, or we try to morph it into something else, or we just outright pretend it didn't happen, and then try to replace it with our conditioned internal belief about what should have happened or what should be happening. That's uncomfortable. That's suffering. And the reason it's suffering is because it's not real. Now, a deeper understanding of this becomes quite surprising, and that is that even when things happen that are violent or come from a place of extreme unconsciousness, what I found is reactivity to that is actually what gets transmitted. Even if that reactivity is justified, it's taking the right position. It's understandable and it makes sense, but what it does is it transmits a little pain body, a little unconsciousness, a little falseness, and that drops down into our own unconscious, and it can germinate there and come out in other ways. So by looking very closely at what it is that reacts and the mechanism and belief system behind reaction, we can undermine that tendency to react in ways that are unconscious, that are ultimately detrimental to us. This is the work of equanimity. Like so many things in this process, it sounds one way until you really dig into it, and it turns out to be a pretty radical process. But also, like every step of this path, it's a huge blessing if you're willing to really go there and see what's actually happening.